have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly. I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order.
President-elect Donald Trump promising to end the war in Ukraine in just one day. His comeback giving him the chance to make good on that when he enters the White House. On this special episode of Reuters World News, we look at how the new US president is likely to deal with Russia and Ukraine, what that might do to the long-term relationship between America and its allies in Europe, and what it means for restraining bad actors from future invasions. I'm Tara Oakes in Washington, D.C. So I'm joined today by our US foreign policy editor, Don Durfee, here in D.C., and our Europe editor, Rachel Armstrong, back across the pond in London. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Tara.
Thanks very much.
So, Don, is there any level of predictability that Ukraine can at least pin its hope on or try and navigate by? Can Trump's foreign policy be characterized in any particular way as isolationist, as transactional, as anything else?
Yeah, I don't think it fits any clear labels, honestly. There are elements of it that are isolationist, right? But you cannot call Trump an isolationist, right? In his first term, the U.S. did remain engaged in various issues in different kinds of ways. So what some people call Trump's foreign policy in the first term was, if anything, erratic. It would sort of swing from one issue to the next. One theme that you can see, however, is, Trump considers himself a deal maker. And one element of his deal making is to apply great pressure on your negotiating partner and then come in for some sort of a negotiation with Russia and Ukraine, applying pressure and then trying to bring them to the table.
Trump was clear on the campaign trail that he wants to end the war. He also repeatedly attacked the amount of money and support that the United States is giving Kyiv. But he hasn't been so clear on how he would go about ending the war and how he'd do it so quickly. So, Don, what do we know right now about that how?
The Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance, has said recently that the plan is basically to allow Russia to keep much of the territory that it has gained and then offer a guarantee that Ukraine never joins NATO. There are some other proposals that are out there. So one is Keith Kellogg, who may have a role in the coming administration. And what he's described is a little bit more nuanced. It's to sort of put a ceasefire along prevailing battle lines and basically put a lot of pressure on both parties to come to the table. So for Ukraine, it might be to say, if you don't come to the negotiating table, the U.S. will cut off aid to you. And for Russia, it's to say, if you don't come to the table, then the U.S. is going to give Ukraine everything that it needs to defeat you eventually. And that there might be, a situation where Ukraine doesn't have to formally cede territory, but they would halt along the battle lines, and that Ukraine would sort of put off joining NATO for a certain period of time. But, those are, what his allies have said. Trump himself has not been highly specific about how he's going to do this.
So there are scenarios where Ukraine would have to give up territory and aid and NATO membership be used as negotiating tactics. Zelensky isn't likely to be happy about that, right? What about the rest of Ukraine? Rachel, what's the view of what Trump wants and how that leaves them?
At the government level in Ukraine, the appearances Kyiv feel they need to find a way to communicate and work with Trump very quickly. Zelensky offered his congratulations immediately after Trump declared victory, using language like finding peace through strength that people suggest is probably trying to use the language that they think Trump would recognize and welcome.
Through strength. But
Ukraine faces a huge diplomatic challenge in that up until this point in the war, the White House has largely not been communicating at the level of President to Putin at all. Now it feels that Trump will be willing to do that, and Kyiv will need to move pretty fast to be part of that conversation and try and make sure there's not too much dialogue going on at which they're not having any kind of say. If you go down from government level, the mood in Kyiv and beyond in Ukraine is very downbeat when our correspondents there speak to people. But the mood was very downbeat going into this election. The war is at a very difficult stage. Russia has made a lot of advances. There's a very difficult winter coming up with a lot of attacks on energy facilities. And while polls show the majority of Ukrainians want to keep fighting the war, that percentage is actually creeping down. It's now around 63%. And there is a big sense of weariness in Ukraine and a feeling that if the West doesn't allow a big uplift in support through weapons and the change in the rules that allow missile strikes from Ukraine into Russia, that Ukraine will keep losing land and people. That was a feeling going into the election. The mood is even more downbeat than with Trump, but it's perhaps not quite as knee-jerk a mood shift as one might expect, as either way, the Ukrainians were not feeling too optimistic about the path of the war.
So what about on the Russian side? This is President Putin congratulating Trump on his win.
It's very difficult to gauge the mood in Russia, but clearly Putin, in his address at Sochi, wanted to put out some very clear messages. He was praising Trump. He used language that I think Russia watchers would say he'd have picked very carefully to appeal to Trump, such as praising the way Trump responded to his assassination attempt, and indicated that he wants to speak to Trump very soon. Moscow is clear to state that their stated aims for the war have not changed, that they want what they term Ukraine neutrality, which in normal language means Ukraine will not be part of NATO, Ukraine will not be part of the European Union, and security guarantees that are offered to Ukraine will not look anything like the type of security guarantees it would have if it were part of NATO. Some people have suggested in Moscow that given the momentum on the battlefield is with Russia at the moment, that perhaps the current lines in Moscow's eyes might not even be ambitious enough, and that they want to keep pushing during this winter ahead of any talks for an even potentially bigger land settlement. So Moscow is definitely sending signals to Trump that they are keen to talk, but they're not sending any indications of any type of compromises they might make.
And Don, is Trump sending any signals back to Moscow?
Well, Trump has a pretty warm relationship with Vladimir Putin. I think he's someone that he admires in many ways. I think it's worth saying that from the Russia side, there may be a little bit of skepticism or wariness about Trump. You know, when he first came in 2016, there was a lot of celebration that things were turning Russia's way and an expectation that maybe the United States might, loosen sanctions against Russia for, the annexation of Crimea. And, the opposite happened. The Trump administration added additional sanctions. They eventually decided to give anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainians. So I think even this time, they look at some maybe warm feelings between Trump and Putin, but maybe not an expectation that everything will start going Moscow's way.
So neither the Ukrainian side nor the Russian side are expecting a Trump presidency to be unilaterally favorable one way or the other. And Europe has tried to show a united front in support of Ukraine, but that's splintering, with Zelensky heading to a summit in Hungary this week to try and bolster support. Rachel, has there been any sense of unity between the European leaders on how to continue their support for Ukraine and how to work with Trump?
European leaders arriving in Budapest were all singing from the same hymn sheet when it came to saying we need to find a united response. Europe needs to work together. There was also a pretty widespread agreement among leaders that Europe needs to increase its responsibility for security rather than relying quite so much on the United States and upping defense spending. But on Ukraine itself and the best strategy, there is a very clear division. Viktor Orban, who enjoys a close relationship with Trump, has been calling for an immediate ceasefire. He has been saying that Europe has to change its policy on Ukraine radically because the United States, and his words, will, under Trump, pull the US out of the war. That is not the approach that most of the rest of Europe wants to take. They believe that it should be Ukraine which takes the main calls on when talks should begin, and that they need to keep support going. But there is a big but here. Very few European governments are in a position politically, fiscally, to be able to commit a huge amount of extra financial support, and certainly not at the level that Ukraine says it needs.
And yeah, Orban fancies himself as something of Europe's Trump whisperer, right? Is that something that Trump or the Europeans would welcome?
So as Don was saying earlier, it's very difficult to predict Trump. Most of the Europeans do not see Viktor Orban as someone who is representative of the region. When he went on his self-styled peace tour earlier in the year, it was met with a lot of anger in Brussels and beyond. He had not consulted with EU members before he went on this mission. So there may, though, be a sense of realism that do you need someone who at least Trump admires, has a relationship with, to do the communication? Potentially. Hungary has a lot at stake with the tariffs that Trump is threatening to impose. Hungary has a huge auto industry, which makes up a large part of its exports. Will there be a sense that Orban, as much as people would have to do it through gritted teeth, could be some sort of lead negotiator on all things Europe? Perhaps, but I think they may look at someone like Giorgia Meloni, who is another European leader on the far right, who has been a long-time admirer of Trump, who is certainly not as close to Trump as Orban is, but generally gets on well. She won't have a string of embarrassing tweets criticizing Trump that she'll have to rapidly delete that other politicians have. And she is a leader of a G7 country. So we're trying to watch the mood music in Budapest at the moment, because I don't think many people in Europe really want Orban to be their lead representative when it comes to Trump. And whilst Meloni is to the right of the governments in France and Germany, she has shown since she took office that she can do deals in the EU.
I agree with what Rachel said. And it's worth remembering that, so Trump and Orban do have a close relationship. Trump does have a record of listening to the people that he admires, and that sometimes can end up shaping policy. And Orban may not be a very influential figure in Europe itself, but within the sort of far-right MAGA movement, he is definitely seen as a major figure in this, what they see as the culture wars, and very much aligned in terms of cultural values with what a lot of the American far-right think that the country ought to be doing.
And in many ways, it's not been a great few days for Ukraine to pin its hope on consistent support from anywhere, right? The German coalition government this week collapsed over financial support for Ukraine. So what happens if Europe can't meet a Trump presidency with at least a united position and some concrete, strong financial support for Ukraine?
I think that's the underlying fear of all the discussions going on in Budapest at this week's summit. I think there is a fear that that would potentially lead to the war ending on terms that no one in Europe, and certainly no one in Kyiv, wanted to see, and a sense of alarm perhaps for what it might mean for the rest of European security. There is a challenge at the moment that the collapse of the government in Germany leaves a big hole at the centre of Europe. There were a lot of murmurings about what is it that both the Biden administration and the rather ailing governments in France, Germany can do in the next few months that might prevent that from happening. There could be a very serious moment of reckoning if Europe isn't able to come up with more funds on spending for Ukraine and spending for defense in general.
There's not enough financial support for Ukraine or military support. Really what that does is it puts additional pressure on Kyiv to come to the bargaining table, which is what Trump, I think, would like to see. The question at that point, as Rachel was suggesting, is that, does the war end on terms that anybody in the West wants to see? One of the real worries among many people, in diplomacy and who think about geopolitics is the signal that sends to Russia, first of all, right? It succeeded in holding on some territory that it, following an illegal invasion, but also to countries like China who have ambitions to eventually take Taiwan someday, right? Might they see that as a potential green light for their own actions? So it's something that really could reverberate well beyond Europe.
And Zelensky has been really underlining the presence of North Korean troops in the region in recent weeks and the threat that their presence means for possible global escalation. Don, is that messaging likely to be effective in convincing Trump to offer more support to Ukraine?
I don't think so, honestly. I think the entry of North Korea into this war really does complicate things. It makes things a lot more dangerous, frankly. But from Trump's perspective, he just wants to end this war. And I think we have every reason to believe that's what he'll push for. So I think, the entry of North Korea into this doesn't really change that calculus. It's worth remembering that he has a complicated relationship with North Korea. In his first administration, there was a lot of pressure that his administration put on Pyongyang with the fire and fury talk. And then that was quickly followed by attempts at negotiations with the North Koreans over their nuclear program. And Trump and Kim Jong-un themselves have this sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a warm relationship necessarily, but they do have a relationship. So that's a complicating factor here. But at the end of the day, I don't think it will change Trump's approach on the Ukraine issue.
Thank you so much to Rachel and Don for joining me today and for our teams reporting on the ground in the US, Russia and Ukraine. Reuters World News is produced by Jonah Green, Gail Issa, David Spencer, Christopher Walljasper and Sharon Reichgarson. Our senior producers are me, Tara Oakes and Carmel Crimmins. Our executive producer is Leela DeKretzer. Sound design and music composition are by Josh Sommer. We'll be back on Monday with our daily headline show. And make sure you follow us on your favourite podcast player or download the Reuters app.